Jasmine Crockett walked into a budget hearing with a folder of documents, and walked out having exposed the president's secret billion-dollar tax breaks. Washington was heavy that morning, not with weather, but with the weight of what people weren't saying. Room 2123 in the Rayburn House office building was packed tight, but quiet. Too quiet. Staffers fidgeted with coffee cups. C-SPAN cameras rolled silently. Everyone was waiting. At the center of the long oak table sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, composed in a steel blue suit. Her expression said she hadn't come to play polite politics today. On the opposite end, just a few feet away, President Donald Trump sat with arms crossed, his usual swagger held in check by the setting. He wasn't supposed to be there. Presidents didn't usually attend these budget hearings in person, but this one was different. Rumors had swirled for days, something about last-minute changes in the fiscal package, whispers about loopholes and favors. Trump showed up to look strong. Crockett showed up to pull threads. As the committee chair opened the hearing, the air felt tight. He ran through formalities, yielding the floor to Representative Crockett for her opening remarks. There was no fumbling, no throat clearing. She leaned forward into her mic like someone ready to flip the lights on in a room full of cockroaches. "I'm not here to waste anyone's time," she said, "but I have a duty to lay bare a pattern, one that affects every taxpayer in this country, especially the ones who don't own skyscrapers in Manhattan or golf resorts in Florida." A few heads lifted. Murmurs began. Trump's expression didn't move, but his fingers started tapping against the desk. Crockett continued. "Last night, I received documents from the Congressional Budget Office that were not previously disclosed to this committee. These include internal memos, flagged communication, and a budget appendix, one that had been quietly edited just weeks before submission." That got attention. A few senators straightened in their chairs. "Hidden in the back end of that budget," she said, holding up a thick binder, "are specific provisions granting deep tax exemptions to luxury real estate developers, several of whom operate under shell LLCs that trace back directly or indirectly to Trump Organization affiliates." The room froze. For a full second, no one moved. Then Trump leaned forward, pulling his mic closer. "This is a disgrace," he barked. "These are lies. Fabricated Democrat lies. More garbage." Crockett didn't blink. "I'm not finished," she said simply. The chair reminded everyone to respect decorum, but it was already too late. The energy had shifted. Cameras zoomed in. The journalists in the back row leaned forward. Crockett flipped to a marked page. Her voice never cracked. "We are looking at a projected deficit increase of $312 billion tied to these tax exemptions alone. I'm not speculating. I'm citing confirmed models. These aren't numbers I created. They come from bipartisan economists, some of whom were appointed during your administration." Trump started to speak again, but the chair cut in, giving Crockett back the floor. There was a pause. Crockett let the silence settle before driving in deeper. "Now, Mr. President, since you've chosen to attend today, I have one question." She lifted her eyes from the pages and locked them on him. "Who is this budget meant to serve? The families struggling with rent in Tucson, Arizona, or your own empire?" A gasp moved through the room. Trump's face reddened, but Crockett didn't press further. She closed her binder and leaned back, letting the silence speak. Outside the building, the media was already scrambling. Inside, the story was only beginning, but no one, not even Crockett, could have predicted what would happen once the camera stopped rolling. The room didn't breathe for a full 10 seconds after Jasmine Crockett's question landed. A congressional hearing isn't usually built for drama, but this one suddenly felt like a courtroom, a press conference, and a bombshell news drop wrapped into one. President Trump didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, glanced at one of his aides, then looked down like he was brushing something off his sleeve. But it wasn't indifference, it was control. He wasn't going to bite. Not yet. The committee chair, clearly rattled, cleared his throat and tried to restore order. "We'll move forward with statements from other members of the committee." But Crockett raised her hand again. "Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I believe the numbers I've presented require immediate clarity before we move on. I'd like to request that the President respond directly to the question." There it was, an open challenge. Trump took the bait. He leaned in slowly like someone about to give a TED Talk with clenched teeth. "Let me tell you something, Congresswoman," he began. "This budget is the strongest, most effective plan we've ever put together. People are winning. Businesses are winning. Jobs are up, taxes are down, and America's finally running like a business again. Crockett nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in anticipation. She was letting him talk, and that unnerved him. He kept going. I don't know where you're getting your numbers. Probably from some left-wing newsletter, but the real people out there, they know I've made them richer, safer, better. What you're doing is playing a tired political game. That got him applause from a few loyalists seated behind him. But something had shifted. Crockett's response wasn't fiery, it was surgical. With respect, Mr. President, she said, I don't need to rely on any newsletter when the source of these numbers is the agency your own party fought to protect just 3 years ago, the CBO. She clicked a remote. Behind her, a large screen blinked to life with a chart. It was simple. 2 lines, one red, one blue. The red line, a curve showing corporate tax cuts related to commercial real estate. The blue line, public infrastructure investment. The divergence after Q2 of the current fiscal year was sharp. The red line shot up, the blue plummeted. This, she said, is what's being funded. And this, she pointed to the sinking blue line, is what's being neglected. Gasps, audible ones. Reporters started typing faster. One of the older committee members whispered something to his staffer, who immediately got up and left the room. Trump scoffed. You're doing charts now? It's a show. It's theater. This is nothing but budget manipulation. Crockett didn't flinch. She walked toward the screen, clicked again, and up came an email thread. The names weren't blurred. One in particular, R. Bayfield, a known Trump economic advisor, CC'd on the internal discussion about real estate carve-outs for presidential affiliates. Crockett read the subject line aloud. Ensure Section G48L remains untouched before submitting. Sensitive items must be shielded. She turned back to the room. This isn't about partisanship. This is about transparency. And every taxpayer watching this hearing deserves to know that more than $100 billion in write-offs is directly benefiting people tied to the president's own financial portfolio. One of the Republican committee members, a younger congressman from Wisconsin, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That's when you knew things were starting to stick. Trump looked at the screen, jaw tight. I don't know what that is. I haven't seen that. Could be fake. Could be Russian. Who knows? The room didn't laugh. That kind of deflection used to draw chuckles. Not today. Crockett remained still. It's from your office, Mr. President. It was flagged by your own staff as sensitive, and it's been authenticated by 2 bipartisan budget analysts this morning before I walked into this room. Then she did something subtle, but powerful. She stepped back from the podium, placed the clicker down, and folded her arms. She said nothing else, because she didn't need to. The weight of her silence pressed against every corner of that room, and for the first time that morning, President Trump didn't have a comeback ready. But outside that room, the story was just beginning to catch fire, and the public was about to weigh in. Within an hour of the hearing going live, newsrooms from Sacramento to Baltimore scrambled to cut the footage down for prime time. Social media exploded. The clip of Jasmine Crockett calmly presenting the email thread hit nearly 2 million views by mid-afternoon. But that wasn't even the biggest problem for the White House. Inside the West Wing, the atmosphere was no longer confident. It was reactive. By 2:30 p.m., Trump's senior advisor, Gina Moretz, was pacing in the Roosevelt room with 2 phones in her hand, one pressed to her ear, the other buzzing nonstop. No, do not let him tweet yet, she barked to an aide. We need verification on the leak. If Bayfield's name is on that memo, we can't spin this. Meanwhile, back on Capitol Hill, Crockett had just finished her post-hearing press statement. She didn't gloat, she didn't grandstand. She stood outside, surrounded by mics and flashing cameras, and said calmly, I wasn't elected to sit quietly. I was elected to protect the public's money. And that's exactly what I did today. A few reporters fired off aggressive follow-ups. Was this a political stunt? Would she be introducing a formal ethics complaint? But she refused to take the bait. We'll handle the next steps with transparency, she said. I don't need to yell. The documents speak for themselves. By 5 p.m., the emails had been confirmed authentic. Reuters, AP, and the Washington Chronicle independently verified that the email Crockett had presented wasn't doctored, leaked, or taken out of context. It had come directly from an internal briefing file shared with subcommittee staff, one that had quietly disappeared from the public version of the same budget appendix 2 days later. That deletion also verified, and it got worse. A second file surfaced, unearthed by an intern from the finance office. It was a budget side note, one of those internal working drafts that wasn't meant to be seen. It outlined hypothetical projections for how the carve-outs would affect federal revenue if the luxury exemptions remained untouched for 4 consecutive years. The number at the bottom of the page, $1.04 trillion. That was no longer just a paperwork issue. It was a scandal in the making. Overnight, late-night hosts had a field day. The hashtags #Trump Budgetgate and #Crockett vs. Trump topped trending lists worldwide. A Twitter thread from a Georgia-based economics professor broke down how the budget favored only 1% of taxpayers while leaving states like Mississippi, Idaho, and West Virginia with slashed infrastructure repair budgets. The story wasn't just about ethics anymore. It was about math. And math didn't have a political party. But the part that really turned heads came the next morning on Wake Up America, a conservative morning show based in Dallas. Usually firm supporters of Trump, the hosts sat noticeably stiffer behind their desk. "Look," one of them said, "I don't always agree with Rep. Crockett, but those numbers, they're hard to ignore. I don't know what kind of explaining the White House plans to do, but if it's true that billions were redirected to help real estate developers, especially ones connected to the Oval Office, that's not a partisan issue. That's theft, plain and simple." That clip was replayed on CNN, Fox, and even international channels by noon. Back in D.C., Jasmine Crockett walked into her office that morning with folders tucked under her arm and a single message from her chief of staff waiting on her desk. Bayfield just resigned. She read it twice. Bayfield, Trump's longtime economic advisor, the one who'd been behind the tax structure of the first 3 Trump budgets, the architect of the growth through cuts model Trump had built his second-term fiscal plan on. Gone. His resignation email, brief, vague, and sent to the press before the White House could spin it, was the kind of move a man makes when he sees a ship taking on water. Reporters were already waiting downstairs. Her staff asked if she wanted to hold a press conference. "No," she said, "not yet. Let them talk first. We've got more." Because Crockett knew what was coming. The public outrage had just scratched the surface. The real damage wasn't in the emails. It was in what those exemptions had cost. But what Jasmine didn't know yet was that she'd soon have to pay a price too, just not the kind she expected. By noon, the White House press briefing was packed wall to wall. You could feel the tension. Journalists weren't just here to record, they came to pounce. The press secretary looked uneasy, shuffling notes she hadn't written, rehearsing answers that already sounded outdated. But Trump wouldn't let anyone speak for him this time. He entered the room with the energy of someone looking for a fight. No tie, no teleprompter. Just a stack of printed papers in one hand and a glare that never softened. He ignored the shouted questions until he got to the podium. Then he dropped the stack with a thud. "Let me be very clear," he began, jabbing the podium with 2 fingers. "What you saw yesterday was the most dishonest, staged, disgraceful stunt in congressional history. Jasmine Crockett, she should be ashamed. She's been coached. She's reading from a script. And she's trying to smear the most successful American presidency this country has ever seen." Reporters shouted back, nearly in unison. "Mr. President, was the email from your advisor real? Did you personally benefit from the tax carve-outs? Has your administration deleted official budget records?" Trump raised his voice. "Fake. All of it. The documents were taken out of context, manipulated, probably by some radical left intern. This is political theater, folks. They know they can't beat me in an election, so they're trying to drag me down with phony scandals." He stepped away from the mic, waving a printout in the air. "This budget plan saved American businesses. You know who it hurt? China. You know who doesn't like that? Democrats. Do the math." But for once, the room didn't buy it. Not the way they used to. A veteran reporter from St. Louis finally got his question in. "Mr. President, are you denying the existence of the email thread? It's been authenticated by 3 independent outlets." Trump didn't respond to the question. Instead, he pivoted. "Look at who benefits when Crockett gets headlines. Look at her donors. Look at her district. This is about power, not truth." It didn't land. Later that afternoon, his interview with conservative talk host Craig Forrester was meant to be damage control. But that plan collapsed within minutes. Forrester, known for softball interviews, surprised everyone by opening with a hard jab. Mr. President, I supported your tax policies, but if even 20% of what Crockett said is true, don't you think the American people deserve an honest answer? Trump scowled. You sound like CNN now, Craig. And that was the moment things truly began to slide. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett hadn't said a word all day. She hadn't posted, hadn't appeared on any shows. Instead, she sat behind her desk in her DC office, reading quietly through printouts from the Office of Budget Oversight. Her phone was ringing constantly. Staffers floated in and out, updating her in whispers. Someone had vandalized her district office in Dallas, spray-painted the word traitor across the front door. Her team filed a police report and kept it quiet. Still, she stayed calm. Her chief of staff entered with a furrowed brow. They're saying you might get called for a closed-door hearing. Some GOP members want you investigated for breach of national security. She looked up, confused but not shaken. For reading from a document they buried? He nodded. They're saying the materials weren't properly cleared for public release. They're trying to flip it on you. Jasmine exhaled slowly. Let them. Because she knew what they didn't. She wasn't just holding receipts. She was holding the original drafts, the ones that showed who edited what and when. Those hadn't made it to the hearing yet. But they would. That night, in Ohio, Trump held an emergency rally. The crowd was fired up. The base was loyal, still clapping, still chanting. But something felt off. He ranted about fake scandals, called Crockett a radical puppet, and promised revenge. Yet the fire behind his words didn't match the panic behind his eyes. Jasmine watched from her hotel room in D.C., a legal pad in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just wrote 5 words down on the paper. He's scared. That's my proof. But she also knew fear had teeth, and it wasn't just Trump she had to worry about now. The following morning, at precisely 8:04 a.m., Jasmine Crockett walked into the Committee on Oversight and Accountability with a locked briefcase in one hand and not a single aide by her side. No press, no tweets, no staged photos, just her and the evidence. Inside, the room was quieter than usual. Several of her colleagues avoided eye contact. The ones who did speak kept it brief, polite, cautious. Everyone had heard about the vandalism at her Dallas office. Everyone had read the White House's new memo warning lawmakers not to jump to conclusions over doctored documents and partisan distractions. But none of them had seen what she carried in that briefcase. She opened it only after the room came to order. Chairman Langford gave her the floor, and she walked calmly to the center of the chamber, sliding 3 labeled folders onto the table: Draft A, Draft B, and Final Budget. I'm here today not to argue, but to clarify, she began. In yesterday's hearing, I was accused of misrepresenting the budget and leaking protected materials. So I'd like to walk the committee through exactly what changed between these drafts, and who changed it. She clicked her remote. On the screen appeared 2 versions of the same line from the budget document. One, dated January 19, 2025, included language that capped real estate depreciation deductions at a standard rate. The other, dated February 6th, removed that cap entirely and added a new provision allowing deferred capital gains reinvestment through qualifying partnerships. That change alone accounted for a projected $47 billion revenue loss over 5 years. Jasmine circled a signature block on the February draft. It read, "Reviewed and submitted by R. Bayfield." She didn't gloat. She didn't even pause. She moved on to the next discrepancy. This one hit harder. A section that had once allocated $8.9 billion for nationwide school infrastructure improvements had been reduced to $2.1 billion. The difference? Redirected into a new urban redevelopment incentive, which appeared vague until she pulled up the beneficiary list buried in the appendix. 3 out of 5 listed companies were subsidiaries of a holding group based in Boca Raton. That group had, until 2022, listed the Trump Organization as a 12% stakeholder. Dead silence. Even Chairman Langford's hands started trembling slightly as he gripped the gavel. Crockett turned to face the committee fully. I didn't come here to shame anyone, but I won't sit quietly while the American people are asked to pay more so that billionaires can write off beachfront condos and hollowed-out hotels. A Republican rep from Kansas, a woman who'd remained silent through most of the budget debate, cleared her throat. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, "are you prepared to submit these drafts to the full ethics subcommittee for forensic review?" Jasmine looked her dead in the eye. "I already did, 30 minutes ago." The impact of that landed like a punch. Several aides rushed out of the room. Phones buzzed. Even those who had tried to stay neutral knew this wasn't just political posturing anymore. The documentation was now official. Jasmine gathered her folders slowly, letting the weight of the silence settle. And just before she stepped away from the podium, she delivered the sentence that would be replayed across every news outlet for the next 48 hours. "This isn't about left or right. It's about wrong." The hearing was over in 11 more minutes, but the real story had already escaped the room. That night, 60 Minutes led with the headline, "Crockett releases receipts, Trump budget under ethics probe." Fox News split coverage down the middle. Some anchors questioned the timing, others praised her courage. But one, an anchor from Nebraska with a conservative following, said plainly, "She walked into that room like a lawyer with a case file and walked out looking like a damn prosecutor." Meanwhile, Jasmine refused all interview requests. She didn't hold a rally. She didn't post online. She returned to her district quietly that weekend to meet with teachers and small business owners. One man, a retired Navy mechanic, shook her hand in the parking lot of a grocery store and said, "I don't vote blue, but I back honesty. Whatever this thing is, don't let go of it." She didn't plan to, but with Bayfield gone, someone else was going to take the fall, and the White House already had a name in mind. By Sunday morning, Crockett's 6-word closing line, "This isn't about left or right," had been clipped, captioned, and reshared across nearly every major social platform. But it wasn't just political circles taking notice. It was barbershops in Milwaukee, coffee counters in Fresno, union halls in Toledo, churches in Oklahoma. The momentum had left the Beltway. Even late-night comedy couldn't ignore it. On Saturday Report Live, a sketch showed a parody Trump surrounded by real estate developers in gold suits, high-fiving while a budget burns in the fireplace. The audience howled, but the laughter had an edge. It wasn't just about mockery. It was recognition. People got what had happened. The story had legs. It wasn't about policy jargon anymore. It was about trust. But inside the White House, the tone wasn't just defensive. It was hostile. The press secretary, now visibly strained in daily briefings, pivoted to attacking Crockett's credibility. "Representative Crockett," she said on live TV, "has a history of media-seeking behavior and selectively releasing documents to serve her personal ambitions. This isn't whistleblowing. It's grandstanding." That line didn't land well, especially not after Crockett's chief of staff confirmed that every document she'd presented had already been entered into the House ethics record before the hearing even aired. In fact, her office had sent advance copies to select committee members across party lines. One of them, Representative Lee Withers from Indiana, a longtime moderate, tweeted late Sunday night, "Got the drafts early, fact-checked them, they hold. You don't have to like her delivery to admit her facts are solid. We've got a serious issue here." That post racked up 12 million views and over 350,000 likes in less than 8 hours. And it did something no one expected. It broke the dam open for more moderates to speak. By Monday, several House Republicans were distancing themselves from the budget's controversial provisions. An anonymous source leaked internal GOP messages showing that lawmakers in swing districts were advised to avoid interviews and refrain from defending line-item deductions until further notice. Behind closed doors, White House staff scrambled to contain the fallout. By now, it was clear they couldn't ignore her. So, they went after her background. An op-ed began circulating, unsigned, but clearly sourced from a known strategist close to the administration, claiming Crockett had conflicts of interest due to previous work with a Dallas-based redevelopment nonprofit. They framed it as hypocrisy. The woman accusing Trump of favoritism had once served on the board of a group that received city tax credits. The implication was thin, but damaging. Cable news picked it up immediately. The headlines read, "Is Crockett clean?" The budget bombshell's shadow. Crockett's team moved fast. They released IRS disclosures and city council records within 2 hours of the first op-ed hitting the internet. The documents showed she'd stepped down from the board 2 years prior, long before any redevelopment funding had been proposed or distributed. But it wasn't just about proving a point. She went on local radio that afternoon and addressed it head-on. I've never claimed to be perfect. I've made mistakes, but I've never profited from the pain of the people I represent. And that's the difference. This isn't about one line in a budget. It's about a culture of secrecy and greed that's gotten too comfortable. The host paused, then said quietly, "You don't sound like a politician." Jasmine smiled. Maybe that's the problem. The clip went viral. Again. She hadn't planned to become a symbol, but she was becoming one. Meanwhile, the Ethics Committee confirmed it would begin a formal investigation into the Trump budget revisions. A public hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Crockett had been asked to testify, this time under oath. Her team knew what that meant. Every word would be dissected, every pause, headline fodder. Still, she agreed. What else could she do? She didn't come to D.C. to play small ball. She called her father that night just to hear his voice. "I'm proud of you," he said, "even when it gets messy." Especially then. She didn't cry, but she didn't speak for a moment either. But while the public saw a rising star, there were others watching her with different eyes, waiting, digging, planning. The ethics hearing was set for Thursday, but the real battle began long before that. By Tuesday morning, Crockett's office had received 2 anonymous packages, one containing a shredded photocopy of her old bar license, and the other a single-page letter with no return address, typed in block letters. "You think this makes you clean?" Her chief of staff wanted to involve Capitol Police immediately. Crockett agreed, but only after taking a photo of the letter for her own records. She knew how this worked. Distraction, misdirection, pressure. This wasn't just about smearing her in public. It was about making her question herself in private. Still, she stayed focused. Meanwhile, the hallways of Capitol Hill had taken on a new rhythm. People weren't just whispering. There was calculation in their silence. Some colleagues who had warmly greeted her last week now kept their distance. Staffers she didn't recognize lingered too long outside her office, and 2 committee members on the opposing side of the aisle suddenly requested to review her full evidence stack, citing concerns about transparency, but Jasmine didn't blink. She held a closed-door meeting with her legal counsel that afternoon. They reviewed every file she'd submitted, traced the source of every document, and checked chain of custody logs. Everything was clean. Everything was filed. Still, the pressure grew. At 6:42 p.m., she received a call from Senator Clay DeMars, a long-serving Democrat known for his behind-the-scenes power moves. She hadn't spoken to him directly in months. "Jasmine," he said, voice low and calm, "this thing has grown teeth. If you walk into that hearing and double down, you're not just taking on the president. You're calling out half the committee's donors. I need to know what your endgame is here." She paused, then answered, steady and slow. "My endgame is the truth. Isn't that supposed to be the point?" There was a short silence. "Be careful," he said finally. "Power doesn't just push back. It erases." That stayed with her. Back home in Dallas, the local news showed protesters gathered near her office, half in support, half demanding her resignation. The split wasn't just political, it was cultural. To some, she was a truth teller. To others, a threat to the old, unspoken rules. That night, in her apartment above a bakery in D.C., she sat alone at the kitchen table with the TV on low. She watched a replay of her own testimony from last week, muted, then stared at a sticky note on her fridge. It said, "Be the woman you needed when you were 12. Her mother had written that when Jasmine first ran for local office. She kept it there because it reminded her that fear didn't mean you stop. It just meant you pay attention. At 10:18 p.m., she got a text from a Republican aide she'd met during her freshman orientation. Someone she barely knew. It read, "Off record. 2 committee members meeting with White House counsel tomorrow. They're planning to hit you with a procedural violation. Say you leaked classified attachments." She stared at the message. She could feel what was coming. The playbook was obvious. If they couldn't disprove the evidence, they'd try to discredit how it was obtained. It didn't matter that the files had been verified or submitted by the rules. They just needed doubt. The next morning, her legal team sent a formal preemptive statement to the Ethics Subcommittee, clarifying the classification status of all the files, along with timestamps, clearance tags, and confirmation receipts from staff clerks. It was airtight. But politics didn't run on airtight. It ran on perception. At noon, she got word that the White House had reached out to her alma mater, digging through her law school records, looking for anything, a missed exam, a paper cited incorrectly, something to plant a headline. She laughed. "They're looking in the wrong place," she said to her assistant. "The only scandal from that era is how many ramen packets I survived on." Still, the weight was there. The hearing was less than 48 hours away. And no matter how solid her files were, no matter how many analysts backed her, she knew the room she'd be walking into wasn't built to protect truth-tellers. It was built to preserve power. But power's grip weakens when enough people start asking the right questions, and Jasmine had made sure the questions couldn't be ignored. The night before the hearing, Jasmine Crockett flew home for 6 hours. Just 6. It wasn't in the schedule, and it wasn't strategic. She just needed to see her father. She arrived in Oak Cliff, Texas at 10:17 p.m. and knocked quietly on the screen door. Her dad, Harold Crockett, was already waiting. He didn't ask questions, just opened the door and gave her that kind of hug that made you feel like the world could burn down and someone would still put their arms around you. They sat in the living room, the lights dim, the old ceiling fan clinking like it always had. The house hadn't changed since she was in high school. Same carpet, same coffee table with a scratch shaped like Texas in the middle. Comfort wasn't a luxury. It was a memory. Her father poured them both a glass of sweet tea and leaned back in his recliner. "You good?" he asked gently. Jasmine nodded, but didn't say anything at first. She looked down at her hands, then out the window where the street lamp flickered against the neighbor's truck. "I don't think they want the truth, Daddy," she finally said. "I think they want to break me." Harold took a long sip of his tea before answering. "Course they do," he said. "You're dangerous to 'em now. You did what they always thought you wouldn't. You stayed calm, you stayed smart, and you didn't back down." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't fight fire with fire, baby. You fight it with water. But you better expect the smoke. It'll burn your eyes before it clears." That's when she felt the tears push up behind her eyes, and for a moment, she didn't fight them. She let one slip, just one. They talked for another hour, not about politics, about old teachers, her mom's sweet potato pie, the way her little brother used to pretend he was a lawyer in the hallway, arguing with the coat rack. It grounded her. It reminded her why she did this in the first place. The next morning, she was back in D.C., but things had escalated. Her office had received a direct threat through encrypted email, anonymous but detailed. It referenced personal information that hadn't been made public. Her middle school, her church, her first job out of law school. Capitol Police increased her security detail. Her staff quietly pulled her schedule from the public website. The team knew this wasn't political anymore. It was personal. The kind of personal people use to silence someone. But Jasmine refused to go quiet. At noon, she met privately with 3 freshman members of Congress, one independent, one Republican, one Democrat. They sat in a nondescript cafe 3 blocks from the Capitol, phones off, no aides. "I'm not asking you to agree with me," she said, looking each of them in the eye. "I'm asking you to read the same files I read, look at the same numbers, and ask yourself if you'd be okay explaining this to your voters." The Republican, Shane Kinley from Montana, nodded. "I did. And no, I wouldn't be." That was something. She didn't expect open endorsements, but even silence from the right people was power. It meant fewer attacks. It meant space to move. That night, she stood alone in the hallway outside her apartment, key in hand, breathing deep. She knew once she walked inside, it was game time. There'd be no more breaks, no more safe moments. Her phone buzzed with a text from her communications director. "Press outside, 4 networks, holding their questions till after hearing." She didn't reply. Instead, she opened the door, walked in, and sat down at her kitchen table. She didn't rehearse a speech. She didn't go over her notes again. She just stared at her laptop screensaver, a photo of her and her niece on the front steps, eating popsicles. No makeup, no cameras, just real life. That's what she was protecting. That's what they'd forgotten. She wasn't here for showmanship or legacy. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was defending something simple, the right for people who don't have billion-dollar tax shelters to know what's being done in their name. But when she walked into that hearing room the next morning, she didn't expect who would try to stop her from speaking, and what it would cost her. The morning of the ethics hearing, Capitol Hill buzzed, but not in the usual way. This wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett anymore. It was about how many people had started paying attention. Voters, veterans, single moms, truck drivers, People who'd never watched a budget hearing in their life now had live stream alerts turned on. The room was filled before sunrise. The press rows overflowed. YouTubers live streamed from folding chairs in the back. Outside, a crowd gathered behind metal barriers, some holding signs that read, "Truth Matters," others yelling into megaphones about deep state conspiracies. But inside, it was still, cold, controlled. At 9 a.m. sharp, Chairman Ridley called the hearing to order. Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, folders closed, hands folded. She wasn't jittery. She wasn't performing. She looked like someone waiting to tell the truth, and she knew most of the people in that room were hoping she'd slip up. Before she could speak, Ridley cleared his throat and launched into a prepared statement. "Before we begin," he said, "it's important to note that certain materials previously presented in public hearings are now under procedural review. Until that review is complete, any further reference to those documents may be deemed a breach of conduct." It was a warning, wrapped in process, delivered like a threat. Jasmine didn't blink. "I understand," she said calmly, "but the truth doesn't care about your process." Gasps, a few chuckles, even a cough from the back of the room sounded like it held surprise. The hearing continued. Questions came at her hard. "Where did you obtain the budget drafts? Were you aware of their clearance status? Why didn't you raise concerns through internal channels first?" She answered each one plainly, with dates, emails, and records that she had printed and brought herself. Nothing flashy, just precise. But then came the turn. Representative Glendon Wright, an older, staunch Trump ally from Missouri, leaned into his microphone and said, "Congresswoman, you seem very confident. But is it possible, just possible, that your staff mishandled sensitive files in their eagerness to make a point?" It was a setup, one she saw coming. Jasmine nodded slowly. "Sure, anything's possible, but not everything is true." She pulled out a thin folder and slid it toward the committee clerk. "This is a full copy of our internal chain of custody documentation. Every file was logged, time-stamped, and signed by official congressional staff. I'll remind this committee that I'm not just a congresswoman, I'm an attorney, and unlike some people, I read the fine print." Wright opened his mouth, then shut it again. The chair turned red. Someone coughed. Reporters scribbled faster. Then, from the left side of the dais, something unexpected happened. Representative Lynn Novak, a Republican from rural Iowa, spoke. "I've reviewed those documents. My staff called 3 former CBO analysts to cross-reference the claims. The math holds. Whether we like the optics or not, the content checks out." A hush fell over the room. Novak wasn't a moderate. He wasn't a media darling. He was known for siding with the party on nearly every vote, and now he was saying, plainly, that she was right. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't even smile. She just gave a short nod of thanks. That was the moment the dam cracked. By afternoon, news outlets had pivoted. Headlines shifted from "Budget controversy deepens" to "Crockett's facts hold under fire." Radio hosts who dismissed her as a grandstander now softened their tone. One even said, "Maybe we owe her a second look." Public sentiment turned fast. Phone lines in congressional offices rang off the hook. Voters wanted answers, not angry sound bites, not excuses. They wanted someone to explain why the budget had been quietly rewritten to help billionaires and gut public programs. At a town hall in Spokane that night, a Republican congressman was booed for defending the exemptions. It wasn't a liberal crowd. It wasn't a staged protest. It was voters, regular ones, and they weren't buying the old script anymore. Back in D.C., Jasmine Crockett left the hearing through the side exit. No cameras, no reporters. She walked quietly to her car, climbed in, and sat there for a long moment before turning the key. Her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. "They're going to try one more time. Be ready." But this time, she wasn't the only one standing. America was paying attention, and that changed everything. The final blow didn't come from the committee or a press leak or even the White House. It came from within. 2 days after the hearing, a staffer from the House Budget Office, Landon Shaw, mid-30s, unknown to the public but respected on the Hill, resigned quietly. No press conference, no comment, just a simple letter submitted at 4:12 p.m. on a Friday. But inside that letter was a statement attached under seal. a sworn affidavit. It confirmed everything Jasmine had said. Not only were the budget documents legitimate, but Shaw detailed how multiple edits had been made under pressure from Bayfield and another advisor whose name hadn't been made public. Until now, that name, Garrett Nolan, a longtime fixer connected to various financial shell operations, including some with direct ties to a Florida-based redevelopment fund that had profited from the carve-outs. By Sunday, the press had the document, and by Monday, Crockett was no longer a controversial figure on TV. She was the lawmaker who broke open the largest ethics investigation into a presidential budget in modern history, but it hadn't come without a cost. In the days following Shaw's affidavit, Jasmine faced threats that went beyond emails. A tinted SUV had followed her from the Hill to her apartment 2 nights in a row. Her office had been briefly evacuated due to a suspicious envelope, thankfully a false alarm. Her staff rotated shifts for safety. Her family begged her to take time off. She refused. "I can't back off now," she told her father on the phone, "not when we're this close to something real." Because what she'd uncovered wasn't just corruption. It was a blueprint. A system that quietly funneled public funds into private wealth under the guise of policy jargon and economic theory. Most Americans never noticed because it wasn't written in headlines. It was hidden in footnotes. But Jasmine had made people notice. At a town hall in Phoenix, a mother of 3 stood up with tears in her eyes. "My son's school hasn't had working AC in 5 years," she said, "and they cut the repair funding so someone could build condos in Palm Beach?" The room was silent. That's when Jasmine realized something. This wasn't about a headline or even a victory in a hearing. It was about letting people see what had always been there and giving them language to name it. She started receiving letters from people she'd never met. Postal workers, veterans, single dads, college students drowning in loan debt. Most didn't write with politics in mind. They wrote about broken trust, about how they didn't believe anyone in DC cared about them, until now. One message read, "You made me feel like somebody in that room was actually fighting for us. Thank you." Another said, "I never thought I'd understand a federal budget hearing, but you made it clear, and now I'm angry." That's when she knew she'd done something more powerful than expose fraud. She'd started a conversation, and now people weren't just watching, they were asking. At her next press conference, Jasmine stood before the